Welcome to the first session of our Extension Explorers summer series on brewing beer at home. We will begin with our guest speaker today, and he will share with us insights on brewing beer at home. If you have questions, please drop those in the chat, and at the end of his presentation, we will have time for him to answer. We are so excited to have Mr. Chris Meadows with us today. Mr. Meadows is currently an instructor for the Brewing and Distilling Center and the head brewer at Yeehaw Brewing Company. He has many experiences in the brewing industry and holds an advanced brewing and fermentation science degree from the American Brewers Guild. Most recently, Chris and Yeehaw Brewing Company partnered with the University of Tennessee's Institute of Agriculture in the grand opening of the Hop Yard, which is part of UT's East Tennessee Ag Research Education Center. The point of the Hop Yard is to experiment with different kinds of hops to see which one works the best in beer and grow the best in East Tennessee. So please join me in welcoming a friend of UT, Mr. Chris Meadows.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate that. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and get started. If anybody has any questions, like she said, just please put those in the comments and we'll kind of address those as we go. We're going to learn today about fermentation, or the basics of fermentation, and what we need to maybe do this at home for the first time. So we're primarily going to focus on what's called extract brewing. In professional brewing, we take water and grain and actually turn that into an extract ourselves in our brew house. But that requires some special equipment. So the easiest way to get started, and in fact, the way that I got started when I was, maybe 2009, so it's been a little while, was to use extracts that are already made by different companies, and then you can blend in specialty grains to kind of make your own beer. So it's an easy way to get started with only one or two things at home. You don't have to buy a full brewery worth of equipment. But we'll go over a lot of equipment that we need, different processes that we need, and critical steps to make alcohol in the form of beer. So we'll go ahead and get started on this one. There's a lovely picture of me covered. If you look closely, I'm covered in stuff. They didn't tell me I was having a photo shoot that day, so I actually had beer stuff splattered all over my shirt. But that's kind of what beer can do. Professional brewing, it's a lot of fun, but it's like 95% making mess and cleaning mess. Very, very little fun. It's hard, hot work to do it in a professional environment, but it's a lot of fun to do that as a hobby at home if you know the basics. So that's what we're kind of going to explore a little bit today. Some of the basic equipment we might need, we need a heat source. So if you're going to do this in your kitchen, you can use any stove. If you have a gas burner or an electric burner, that's okay, as long as you've got a flat bottomed stainless steel pot, or really any pot. An aluminum pot would be fine too, just to get started. You can see this picture here, this pot with the temperature gauge and a valve on it. They make specialty pots like this that already have the thermometer built in and the valve at the bottom, so you can drain your wort off. But a normal like spaghetti pot works, a big deep soup pot works just fine. You've just got to be able to get that hot sugar water out of there safely. So that's why most homebrewing equipment has a valve or a temperature gauge on it, so you can watch that. Most homebrewers start as a 5-gallon batch. And the reason for that is places like Northern Brewer, which is a website, and morebeer.com sell 5-gallon buckets, also with little valves on the bottoms and lids on tops that can kind of seal everything up. After we boil our liquid, we want to be able to cool it down. So in a professional environment, we'd use a heat exchanger and like a glycol refrigeration unit. But at home, you can do this just by filling your sink up or a cooler up with ice and then setting your stainless steel pot in it to cool it down. There's also some little heat exchangers you can put in the wort itself to cool it down, so the cold water can get pumped through there and cool your liquid without actually diluting your liquid. A spoon, thermometer, we need some sanitizer to clean our fermentation bucket. And the reason why sanitation is really important is infection or organisms that we don't want in that wort can eat that sugar. So it's a really important lesson to be super clean and sanitized when you're making beer, because in nature, anything wants to consume our sugar. You know, there's lactobacillus, there's bacteria everywhere, there's bacteria on us. If we're near a fruit orchard, there might be wild yeast in the air. So it's really important to clean and sanitize your equipment. And one of the reasons you boil your stuff is to actually sanitize the liquid itself that you're going to turn into beer. So the sanitizer is usually sold with these kits to clean your buckets and things like that too. You'll need a little sanitizer in a spray bottle, or possibly some water in a spray bottle to cool down any hot parts. I talked briefly about the plastic fermenter. There are glass fermenters as well, but I recommend as you just starting, a plastic one works just fine. Every glass one that I've ever bought, I've broken just because they're giant 5-gallon glass jugs and they're really easy to break. So if I'm doing it at home, I usually go with the plastic bucket just because I can knock it around and not worry about breaking it. The airlock is for the top lid of the fermentation vessel. And what that does is it allows no oxygen to get in, but it allows any CO2 that's being produced by the yeast that's eating the sugar to escape and not pressurize the container that's in. It's really important to note that if you do it in a closed environment that has no vent, a primary fermentation would probably blow up that container or blow the lid off with how much gas is produced. When the yeast or bacteria if you're doing a sour beer, bacteria is involved too. But a normal beer, the yeast are consuming the sugars, secreting alcohol, and off-gassing CO2. Those are two of their waste products, actually, as an organism. But we've learned to enjoy that as humans. The alcohol is essentially a byproduct of their metabolism, and so is CO2. So you have to kind of know a little bit about what's going on to let that gas escape, so it's a safe container. If you ever can something, or if you ever have some kind of fermentation in your sealed off container, you notice it kind of bulges out and it can blow up a little bit. So that same thing's happening here. The glass hydrometer is essentially a device that will allow us to measure our sugar content. And just to the right of the glass hydrometer is what's called a refractometer. Those are two different ways that we can measure the sugar content. And we need to know that for a few reasons, but the primary one is the amount of sugar we start with, and then the amount of sugar we're ending with at the beginning of fermentation and end of fermentation. We can calculate how much alcohol is there. So that's important to know where you start at. How high is your gravity to start with, and then how low will it get? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is just some of the brief equipment that we're going through so far. After fermentation is complete, you can choose to either bottle your solution in bottles. It's really hard to kind of can carbonated beer. There are some units you can do that with at home. A lot of people who get into home brewing get a kegerator and will actually keg their 5 gallons and kind of serve it to themselves through their own tap. But bottling is the way that I got started. So there's lots of different ways we can bottle. You basically start by taking your fermented beverage to a new clean container that has a bottle wand attached to it. And there's a few different types of bottle wands. There's also, if you look here on the right of the screen, the last straw, that's kind of an advanced one. It's made out of metal. There's some really easy ones to use that are made out of plastic. And then just to the left of that is kind of like if you're getting really into it and you want to speed up the process, that's a 4-head filler that'll allow you to do 4 bottles at once, which just speeds up your process. And that's just kind of to show you there's different steps to the hobby itself. It's pretty easy to get started as an amateur. If you're getting really into it and you don't want it to take all day, there's equipment you can purchase to streamline your process at home. And then the 2 pictures at the bottom are different types of bottle cappers. The red one is one that you do by hand, just put it down on the bottle, and then the black one itself adjusts to different bottle heights and can do it with just one hand. A 5-gallon or 6-gallon container will roughly get you about 54 12-ounce bottles. And that's roughly about 2.5 cases per 5 gallons. So if you're thinking about getting started and wondering how much beer I'm going to make, depending on if it's a really hoppy beer or a really heavy beer, you might have more loss because hops can absorb liquid themselves. Or if it's a really kind of chill beer like an amber lager or a blonde ale, there's not a lot of foreign material to take up a lot of actual space. So you might yield closer to 60 bottles. It just depends on the type of beer you're doing. And we'll talk about different beer styles as well. Because when I first started getting into beer, I didn't know how many styles there were. There's hundreds of styles of beer. And they're all relatively based on historical places and time periods. That's what's really special to me about making beer is There's a lot of new styles being developed all over the world, but historically there's several hundreds different types of beers that we can make based on the region where they're from. An Italian Pilsner is different than a Czech Pilsner, and that's different than a German Pilsner, and that's different than an American Pilsner. They're all similar in scope, but there's different things added to the water chemistry or different types of grain or even different types of hops that are added that kind of accentuate different flavors and help the beer go in different directions. So there's a lot of nuances between styles. And that's another aspect of the hobby that's fascinating to a lot of people, is the historical aspect. And what makes that special is, when you're talking about a German beer, pre-filtration, people would brew with the water they had around them. So different types of beers came from different regions. And one of the things that made them different from each other was the groundwater or the mineral content in the water. There's some beer styles that are naturally salty because the people that developed those beers had a salt water source nearby. So there's different styles of beers that can be, including smoked components like smoked malt. There's different beers there's a traditional beer you can make by getting really hot rocks and dumping the hot rocks in your boil kettle, and it turns the kettle into a boil right away. That's called a Stein beer. So there's so many different types of methods to make beer. Historically, we're just trying to look at the process itself and kind of explore some of the different nuances between styles. So if you're interested in this, you might be able to pick a kit out from an online source or a home brewer shop and kind of take it from there. Let's see. So now we're going to talk a little bit about extract itself. Like I said earlier, the extract is just an easy step to get started. Making your own extract at home is a lot different. There's a few more steps, but like I said before, extract is one of the easiest way to get started. And there's all these competitions all over the world for home brewers, professional amateur people. And then you can make award-winning beer with extract. So it's easy to get caught up in this and say, well, extract is cheating, or extract is easy, or it's not what professionals do. A lot of professionals use extract if they have a lower efficiency on the brew day. Maybe they've got a bad crop of malt and they're not hitting the sugar content they want from their normal pounds that they use in their recipe. You can actually keep some extract on hand and dump that in to kind of get yourself to where you need to be. So it's not cheating, it's a tool. Extract brewing is a tool in our belt. Professional brewers and home brewers, there's really no reason to shame someone using an extract for something. It's all very high quality stuff, and we can all make really good tasting beer in a more simple way, without all the bells and whistles. And I'll show you some setups too of what an all grain setup would look like. And this is kind of what an extract it might look like. There's two different types of extract. There's dry powder, which is just dehydrated. Some people prefer that because it's a powder, it's easier to use. And then some people prefer the liquid extract, which are really, really thick. So you kind of have to put them in a container with warm water, or sit them on the back of the stove for a while and let them soften. Kind of like when you're using honey or molasses in baking, you kind of have to warm it up a little bit to get it to flow. So there's drawbacks to each one. They're identical in terms of capabilities, but it just kind of depends on what you want to get started with. When I first started, I did dry. Then I wanted a little more control, so I went to the wet extract. And then I was curious even more, so I learned how to do it with all grain, and then eventually became a professional brewer because I loved it so much. So it's a bug that catches on quickly. If you get into it, there's lots of ways to get into it very quickly. Let's talk about some of the basic ingredients for beer itself. There's all sorts of alcoholic beverages out there. Wine is made with grapes. Cider is made from apples. Different types of spirits are made from different types of grains. But for the most part, beer is water, barley, hops, and yeast. The sugar source, which is barley and predominantly, can also include wheat. It can also include rye or corn or oats. It just kind of depends on what style of beer you're making. If you're trying to make like a very classic Pilsner style beer, it's probably 100% barley. If you're trying to make a classic American IPA, there's probably some barley and some wheat in that. And then if you know anything about craft beer right now, a hazy, juicy IPA is kind of the newest trend those have a lot of oats in them to kind of give it a velvety texture in the body. So there's lots of different directions you can take. You know, I'm a big fan of rye beers, but rye, just like in rye bread, can be kind of polarizing to people. So there's a lot of options for you to go in. It doesn't have to be just barley. But these are the 4 main ingredients. We have to have water. We have to have barley or some type of sugar source made from a grain. And then we have to have hops. Hops act as a bittering agent. They're also type of a preservative a little bit. They stave off microbial activity. So early on in your fermentation, when there's not a lot of alcohol, lots of things can be competing for your sugar. So the hops kind of help keep certain things like lactobacillus from growing. Unless you want lactobacillus in there, if you don't want that, you don't want a sour beer. So you only want your yeast in there. And the yeast, we'll talk about that too. There's a whole bunch of different varieties of yeast, but there's mainly 2 species. That's kind of it's called a lager yeast and an ale yeast. And one's a top fermenting at a warmer temperature, and one's a bottom fermenting at a lower temperature. So essentially lagering is a word used to describe a cooler, longer storage time. And ales are a warmer temperature and they go a lot faster. So there's different types of nuances, even with the yeast, that we want to talk about too. So we all start with the same 4 basic ingredients. And that's one of the coolest things I like about my job is I'm friends with brewers from all over the world, all over the state, all over the city. And the fact that we all kind of share the same 4 basic things to make widely different varieties of beers is one of the coolest things. I love it so much. I can share my recipe with somebody down the road. They can brew that same exact beer, but change one thing about it. Maybe they choose a different hop or a different yeast, and it's all of a sudden a completely different beer. It's similar in a lot of aspects, but it also provides you a lot of chances to remix certain recipes and try different varieties of things. Maybe you liked your beer as kind of a yellow beer, but you also personally like a little bit darker roasty flavors. So you can include some darker malts the next time you brew that beer and kind of up the roastiness content of that beer. So there's lots of different directions you can choose to go. And since we're talking about beer styles, let's kind of spend a few minutes on this slide. Talked a little bit about ales and lagers already. Those are the 2 main different types of yeast for fermenting beer. There are thousands of types of yeast in the world. That doesn't mean they're all really good at making alcohol. Some bacteria and yeast make all sorts of awful smells. Some of them make some really awesome smells and flavors that we like. Some people really like yogurt. Some people really don't. So fermentation is everywhere, you know, in terms of pickles, slaw, bread. There's all sorts of things that occur to transform an ingredient into something that we like as a product. And beer is no different than any of that stuff. This is kind of the figure on the right here, and then the color chart on the bottom left are kind of just guidelines to show you some of the different styles of beers you can make. Like I said, there's way more styles of beer than this, but when you're looking at go to an American craft brewery, you've got your pale lager, your blonde ale, and then those are kind of the really approachable beers. They're not super bitter. They're not very sweet. There's not a lot going on. It's, you know, in your mind, your catalog of smells and flavors is just basic beer, nothing crazy. Then you might get into the pale ale or the IPA, which is more heavily hopped. So you might get more aromatics like stone fruit or grassiness or herbal context, things like that, just depending on the types of hops you use. Then after that, you get into more of a rich category where you get to the amber and red ales, and then onto the brown and porter and stouts, you get darker. So you get more bold flavors. But as you get darker, you typically get a little sweeter as well. So if you like a sweeter beverage, you may enjoy a brown ale or a porter more than you would like a blonde ale or a pale lager. But if you like those drier beers, or maybe you like brut champagne, you might like something that's dry and bitter. So if you're not a beer drinker, but you're looking to try some things, you can kind of simulate or stimulate your palate by looking at the context of the beer itself. Is this style a dry and bitter beer, or is this style more of a sweet amber chocolatey beer? And judging by that, you can try to find some flavors that you like. So I'm a big fan of IPAs. I really like all sorts of beers, but I like to make a beer that's approachable to somebody. So one of my favorite things to hear is, wow, I really don't like IPAs, but I like your IPA. And so your job as a brewer professionally and as a home brewer, if you're wanting to share your stuff with people, is to try and make it approachable if you want that feedback from people. But if you're wanting to cook for yourself and just make something for yourself, the sky's the limit. There's not a lot of rules to keep you in one category. You can make a hoppy brown beer if that's what you like. It may not sell well in a market, so you have to be considerate to other people's palates. Like right now at Yeehaw, we have a huge patio. So a lot of our customers right now are enjoying being outside. And so for the spring and summer season, we've decided to make a bunch of beers that are a lower ABV and have a little bit drier body. So when they're drinking them in the heat, they don't feel the effects of a 10% beer. But then you get to the winter months where you're spending more time indoors, and you can kind of bump the alcohol level up a little bit and kind of warm people up from the inside. So seasons play a lot in terms of what beer styles you choose to make based on when you're making them. That's not to say you can't have a light beer in the middle of winter. It's just seasonally speaking, just like when we prefer our dishes, we tend to cook a lot more soups or stocks or, casseroles, things like that warm us up when we're in the kitchen. And then on the summertime, we're doing a lot more grilling, a lot more lighter fares, things like that. So beer trending is kind of the same situation. If you're not sure what beer to start with, I recommend something really easy like a blonde ale. And then as you're starting to learn more about it, maybe you can make an amber ale and then base it on seasons as you go. If you're really into it, making stouts and porters as you go. The color chart on the bottom left is another way to kind of help guide how dark or light your beer will be. The standard SRM is a color chart that every brewery uses in America, and it helps us stay in style guidelines for certain styles. If our beer turns out to be a number 3 on the SRM chart, we can't call it a stout. It's not a stout unless it's a 30 or 40 in terms of SRM. And if we have a beer as dark as number 40 here, we can't call that a light lager because it's black. It's not light anymore, and it's usually a heavier beer when it's that color too. So there's all sorts of things to kind of consider. What I normally like to do when I'm choosing a beer is kind of choose a style based on what I want to drink or what I want to sell. Then I'll choose a color, and that helps me choose what types of malts to include. And then I'll choose if it's an ale or a lager, depending on what type of season I'm in or what kind of product I want at the end. So there's lots of opportunity to change things there. And then we talked a little bit about yeast, and I know there's a lot of information on this chart, but this is just a small sample of this company's catalog. Omega Yeast sells professional yeast to everybody. They also brew or sell small packets for home brewers. So if you're really interested in making something, you can look up, there's several different varieties of companies. There's Omega, there's White Labs, Lallemand. There's a whole bunch of people that are making and manufacturing yeast for sale. And the yeast allows you a chance to experience different styles of beer based on different historical preferences. DIPA is an acronym for double IPA, meaning it's a stronger beer. So you might need a yeast that can handle higher alcohol. Some yeast are very finicky, and once alcohol gets above 4 or 5%, they tend to kind of get sleepy in there and they don't really work anymore. So those have been bred to be a lower alcohol beer. And then you've got the ones that perform really well in an alcohol environment, and those have been bred to make higher gravity beers like your 8%, 9%, and 10% beers. Hefeweizen is a type of German yeast that makes certain types of phenolics. If you've ever had a Hefeweizen, it's kind of strong phenolic compounds like banana and clove or spice. That yeast wouldn't do well in an IPA where there's bitterness coming from hops, and it might not do well in a dry roasted stout that's kind of like dark French roast coffee, So not only do we have to be concerned about the color of our beer, the bitterness of our beer, and the sugar content of our beer, we also have to be cognizant of the style of yeast that goes in our beer. British ales can be pretty dry, well attenuative, and then there's different types of yeast that really just don't eat a lot of sugar, and they kind of make a little bit of alcohol and kind of hang out and then just go back to the sleep in the bottom of the tank. That being said, yeast you can use over and over again as long as they're healthy. So harvesting your yeast is another level in home brewing that most people don't really concern themselves with to start with, because it's one more thing to really be concerned about. But for your most homebrew strains, just buying a little small pitch for your 5-gallon container, it might cost you $15 to get that yeast. But if you know how to harvest that yeast and grow it again, that $15 you spend on your yeast pack can be extrapolated out over the course of the next 20 different beers you make. So that just kind of goes back to the whole idea of you can make this as simple as you want it, or you can make this as complicated as you want at home. So it takes up a lot of your time. It depends on what kind of hobbyist you are or how really into it you are. Like I said, there's tons of different types of yeast. This is just a very small example of things you're looking at. And as you look across the top, you've not only got the name description of what kind of beer you might make, you've got the term flocculation. And what that means is a low flocculating yeast stays cloudy up in the solution of your beer, and it doesn't want to come down to the bottom. A highly flocculent yeast will actually clump together. They'll find another yeast buddy. They'll start clumping together in little clumps, and they'll all get heavy and fall down to the bottom of the container. So if you want a very, very clear beer, you would need to find a high or to medium flocculent yeast. If you wanted it to be hazy and you don't mind a little bit of yeast in it, like the Hefeweizen, for example, is a yeasty beer. It's part of its style guidelines is to be unfiltered and kind of hazy. So the Hefeweizen is a low flocculating yeast because it stays in suspension longer. Where if you look at the British Ale 5, it's a highly flocculent yeast. And what that means is after it's done eating sugar and there's nothing left to consume, all those yeast will just fall to the bottom on their own. They won't need any kind of assistance with filtration. There's all sorts of materials we can add to our beer that helps grab the yeast and bring them down to the bottom. That's called clarification. And then if you look at this, the next column, attenuation is basically the term referring to how much of the sugar content they eat of the original sugar content that we measured in the container. So, you know, this DIPA ale might consume 72 to 80% of the yeast. So you can expect about 80% of your sugars to be consumed. And that's how you can kind of help determine how much sugar to start with based on how heavy you want the beer to be. You know, some people like to make a heavy beer because they want to drink one beer and feel it. Some people want to drink several beers and not feel too much effect from it. So you might want a lighter beer that doesn't attenuate all that well. Like the British Ale 8 down here is 67% attenuative. So that might leave you with a little bit of a sweeter body in the beer and a little bit lower alcohol based, whereas the British 1, which might go up to 80% here, if you use the same sugar solution to ferment both of those yeast separately, you would see a higher gravity or a higher alcohol in the British 1 and then a lower alcohol in the British 8 over there. So does that kind of make sense a little bit about what you're looking for, attenuation? And then temperature range is another example of kind of catering to your yeast. Some yeast strains really like it cool, like those bottom fermenter yeasts that we talked about, the lagers. They like to work in a cooler environment. And then when you take a cooler fermenting yeast into a warmer environment, they might express themselves in a negative way. Some off flavors in that environment might be like sulfur compounds or rotten egg or farmy compounds, things like that. So just like us, just like human beings, if we're in good health, if we're in good shape, if we've eaten the right things, if we're in the right environment, we can smell pretty good. But if we are eating garbage all the time and we haven't bathed ourselves, our bodies tend to have some different aromas and do different things. And so yeast are very similar in situations. They can be stressed to do certain things, but most yeast want to stay in a certain range based on how they've been bred or genetically modified to be in that environment. And then alcohol tolerance, we talked a little bit about that. And then compares to is just a column of looking at different types of companies. There's different companies that have different, they all sell very similar things, but they're all called different things. So if you are using someone other than Omega, but you want to use this DIPA ale, for example, you can look at the compares to chart and see another company's variety. Maybe you're at a homebrew store and they only have certain varieties that you're not familiar with. You can actually Google them and see what's similar to that. And maybe the people who you're shopping with have what you're looking for just by a different company or a different name. That being said, here in East Tennessee in Knoxville, we have 2 homebrew stores. Fermentation Station is out near Westtown Mall, or a little bit past that, I think. And then what's the other one called? Allen Beer Mockins is in South Knoxville off Chapman Highway. So if you're looking to support local businesses and kind of get into the hobby a little bit, look up your local homebrew stores. They have everything you need to start up. So if you don't want to choose buying stuff online, you can go to these shops and say, hey, I really like this style of beer or this one particular brand, and I really want to get into it. Can you help me get started? And most of the time they have everything you need to get started. If they're missing one or two things, you can order a lot of that stuff online. 20 years ago, the homebrewing world, things were really sparse. Equipment was hard to find. They're using like modified equipment like coolers or dairy equipment, things like that, pickle buckets. It's a lot easier to find true home brewing equipment that's made for you to use in an easy way. So now we'll quickly look at this slide. We're talking mainly about extract brewing today, but this slide kind of will show us a little bit about the process of making your own extract at home. We're not going to go into too much detail there because it's a whole nother class worth of stuff. But essentially, when you're starting with your grains to make your own extract, you have to start by milling your grain, and you're cracking the hull of the kernel so that water can get inside that kernel. And what's happening here is the water is going to get in there and trigger an enzyme activity to happen in that grain. And enzymes, alpha and beta amylase are two of your main enzymes. They naturally are on a lot of things. We have alpha enzymes in our mouth to help start digesting our food before we even get it. There's enzymes in our saliva that can help start to break down our food before we swallow it. There's enzymes in our stomach that allow our body to take the energy stored in that food and transform it into energy for us. And so it's the same thing here. Barley is somewhat of a grass. It's from the grass family. So when you pick a kernel up off the ground out in the field, you essentially are taking that kernel out of its environment. Whereas if it were to lay there all winter and get wet in the spring, that barley kernel would use its energy to start another version of itself and grow itself a root and a stem and look for sunlight and grow more. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that same energy source into sugar in our beer and feed the yeast. So we're starting by crushing the kernel up a little bit, getting that water in there to start that enzyme activity. There's a certain range of temperatures where those enzymes work in an optimal way. Typically, that's like 145 to 160 degrees. Anything hotter than that, you destroy your enzymes. Anything cooler than that, you don't really activate them in the right way. So just like yeast, enzymes have a temperature sensitive range. And this is one of the reasons why extract brewing is a great place to start for home brewers who are just getting into it, is there's a lot of nuances in making your grain wet to make the perfect extract. So when you skip that step, it just makes it a lot easier for you to get started. It's kind of like an advanced lesson in home brewing. Like I said, I started out with extract brewing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's an amazing way to get started. And then as you learn more about it and be more confident with it, then you can start adding other things to it. So let's see. After we've made our wort, essentially when that sugar water is made, that's called wort now. When all that liquidy stuff is in the grain and it looks like a giant bag of oatmeal, that's called mash. So when you separate that solid ingredient, the sugar water you're left with is called wort. The wort is what the yeast will eat. Boiling wort is important to sanitize it. It's also important for the hops. So a really cool chemical reaction happens when you boil a hop. Hops have an oil that's considered an alpha acid. And what happens when you boil that alpha acid, it actually changes chemically. It doesn't change what it is naturally, it just changes its chemical structure and it becomes isomerized. And so if we don't boil our hops, we won't have any bitterness in our beer. And if you like your beers lightly hopped, not very bitter, then you add a small amount of hops at the beginning and you may not add any more hops throughout that boil. You typically boil for about an hour. But if you wanted a very bitter beer, you would continually add hops as you go. The longer you boil an alpha acid, the more isomerized it gets. And then the more alpha acids you add, the more alpha acids you have to isomerize. So an IPA, for example, would have a lot more hops per pound than like a blonde ale would. And so if you're trying to make a really lightly hopped blonde ale, you may not need more than a few ounces per 5 gallons. But if you're going for a really bitter West Coast style IPA or an English bitter style beer, you're going to go a lot more hops per gallon to try and get that bitterness to come from the hops themselves. The earlier you add them, the more bitter they become. The later you add them, the less bitter they become, and the more you get flavor and aroma from them. So that's why, like, if you're smelling an IPA, you usually can smell it from about a foot away from your face. It's because the amount of hops per gallon is so large, and they've added so many hops post-fermentation or post-boil that you get all those aromatic compounds and flavors from that. So it kind of depends on the style of beer that you're going for, of how many hops you'd add and what style of hop you'd add. Mostly American hops are really fruity, aromatic, tropical, whereas a lot of European hops are more grassy, herbal, and bitter. And it's just largely based on where they're grown and the lineage of plants they have. A lot of the hops we have here in America, they have parents and grandfathers essentially that were hop rhizomes in Europe many, many years ago, but they've been bred so many different ways and grown in different environments that they've yielded different flavors based on where they're grown. A popular hop grown in the Czech Republic is called Saz or Sazer. It's a very distinct classic smell. It's very German and Czech related. So if you've had a German lager or German pils, that grassy bitterness is probably from a Czech style Saz hop. Whereas if you're doing something like a fruity aromatic IPA from America, you might get more mango or pineapple or grapefruit. Those hops were probably grown in the Pacific Northwest. The environment there promotes a lot of different types of oils to grow and not volatilize off. Shelley mentioned earlier, we talked about the hop yard a little bit. We are at the very lowest parallel in Tennessee that can grow hops. Hops are essentially a weed, so the vine can grow anywhere in any kind of environment. But would it make a fruity hop or a real grassy herbal kind of hop? That's largely dependent on its environment of where it grows. Just like a strawberry plant, if it doesn't have the right environment, it's not going to produce any fruit. Hops are the same way. If it's too dry or not enough cooling off times during the night, you might get really small hop cones and with very little oil content. And so that's a whole nother echelon of trying to figure out what works well in your beer. And luckily for us, we have a lot of hop farms and manufacturers that do all that work for us. So all we have to do is buy the pellet and kind of choose what style we want and put those pellets in our beer. But growing them is a whole nother challenge, and that's what we're trying to figure out here. After we boil that wort, we want to be able to cool it off, because if we introduce yeast to a solution that's 210 degrees, that yeast is going to die. It's not going to survive that temperature. So we want to cool that boil kettle back down from 210 degrees to maybe 68 degrees. And what that does is it's the optimal temperature range for certain yeast. There are some yeast that like to ferment at 52 to 55 degrees. Those are typically the lager strains. So they're cooler and they essentially take longer to eat the sugars because they're slower. Ales ferment at a warmer temperature, so they present themselves in a more fruity way and they ferment more rapidly because they're in a warmer environment. I typically do all my ales around 68 to 69 degrees. And then all of our lagers are around 55 to 63 degrees, just to give you a range of temperatures. There's some styles of beers like a Saison, for example, or a Belgian style beer, where those yeast prefer to be in the 80s and 90s to really express themselves. So there's different types of temperature control you can involve yourself in. When you're doing just at home brewing and in a plastic bucket, a closet that stays fairly similar temperature all day is probably the best place to put it. If it's in a garage that's detached and it's really cold at night, you might experience some lags in fermentation because the natural temperature is getting colder during the night or hotter in the summer, vice versa. In the professional world, we have glycol controlled tanks. So what that means is we can control the environment that's inside the tank by cooling or warming up the tank itself. Fermentation does give off an exothermic reaction, so it does warm things up. So if you've got a big batch of beer and you're already starting at 69 degrees, if you don't have a way to cool that, the reaction from consuming sugar and burning all those calories, the yeast give off a lot of temperature heat. So it can actually raise the temperature too hot. Or if you're trying to do a lager at home and you start really cool, if you don't have a way to continuously cool that, it'll eventually end up warmer than it was when you started because of the heat itself given off by the consumption of sugars. That being said, it's if you're doing this at home, if you see a rise of 2 degrees during fermentation, that's totally normal and natural. Nothing weird is going on. If it's in a really hot garage for the summer week, you may not really experience a lot of consistency in that fermentation temperature. So you might have some off flavors, or it might get really hot one night and really cold the next day. All those temperature fluctuations will do things to the beer in terms of its flavor. So the more stable you can have the fermentation, the better quality product you'll have in the long run. But that doesn't mean you'll have a terrible beer. It just means you might not be able to reproduce that exact beer again unless you can simulate the temperature fluctuations that you had during that fermentation. So that's why you have containers that have little sample spouts on them. So you can go sample them every day, check the gravity every day. You can actually taste it and smell it and see for yourself. And you can also check the thermometer and see what the temperature's at inside of there. So the more records you keep, the more information you have to try to make the same beer again in a consistent manner. When you're making beer at home, when I first started out, I didn't really take a lot of measurements. I just didn't really see the need for it because I was just kind of getting into the idea of it. And then as I realized I liked certain flavors or I disliked certain flavors that came from fermentation, I was like, I really need to brew that style of beer in the winter. And this one I really need to brew in the summer. I can't switch those based on the temperature the yeast need or the style of beer that I was going for. So there's a lot of different things to kind of consider, like I said, to further your knowledge and further your control over the product you're making. But if you're just having fun with it, you don't need to concern yourself with too many of the rules other than sanitation and sugar content are two of the main ones. Then down here at the bottom, it says, of course, drinking, pour beer in glass and enjoy. That's one of my favorite parts. Let me check our time. Okay, cool. Let's go quickly. This is more of a professional setup diagram. So we just kind of looked briefly at this hot water tank or cooler. That's where our mash is. Our liquid coming out of the cooler is going to the boil kettle. That's where we're going to add our hops. And then we're going to into the fermentation bucket itself. That's kind of a pretty easy step-by-step home way to do it. This is more of a diagram for your professional brewer, just show you how complicated things can get. We start over here on the top left with our grist mill, and then we go all the way to our mash tun. And you see the water in between. We have hot and cold water to blend with. In professional world, your brewing water is called liquor. So you have hot liquor for your hot water and cold liquor for your cool water. It doesn't actually have any liquor in it. That's just kind of historically what it's called. You introduce that water to your grain in the mash tun. That's where your mash is occurring. Then once you leave the mash tun, you might go to a filtration unit like a false bottom. It's called a lauter tun. This looks like, in this diagram, the mash and the lauter tun are the same vessel. In home brewing, it's kind of the same thing too. Your cooler would have a little false bottom in the bottom of it to hold the physical material and let the wort drain through the grain bed itself. You can see this little pig up here. We give our spent grain to local farmers so that they can feed their animals. I was the brewer here at Elkhorn Exchange when it was open before Yeehaw bought it. And we had been giving our local grain to a farmer for the past 3 years that we were open. And then we weren't able to brew for about 3 months when Yeehaw took over that property because we didn't have a brewing license yet under Yeehaw's name. And so I talked to the farmer and I was like, I'm really sorry I don't have any more grain for you. He was able to get grain from other breweries in town, but I asked him, I was like, what was the impact that my grain had on your processes? How much more feed did you have to buy when you missed out on 1,200 pounds of spent grain a week for those 3 months? And he was like, well, I had to spend about $7,000 more a month in grain to feed his animals. And so, it's one of those things. We're in brewing world, that's a waste product for us. It either goes to a farm and becomes compost. I've used it in my home garden compost a lot. So if you're doing it on a homebrew level, like your 5-gallon batch, you might have 12 pounds of spent grain. When you're done with it, if you have a dog, my dogs have always loved spent grain to eat them. Or I put it in compost for my garden. But anything more than that, you might find a local farmer who can give that to. You can give that to. And our local farmer actually has given us meat a few times based on just saying, here you go. Thanks for helping me out with our feed. But just to show you that local impact, I mean, if he's missing out on a few hundred pounds a week, he's having to spend more money of his own money to feed those animals. And that's just kind of like a byproduct of brewing. So past that, we have the boil kettle. That's where we're adding our hops or other flavors. We might add fruit or honey or spices like rosemary or lavender or cinnamon or cocoa. There's lots of different flavors you can add as you go that you want to infuse in your beer. Post boil kettle, we need to heat exchange that. We need to actually exchange the heat back to our hot liquor tank. So as we pump in cool water through a heat exchanger to cool the wort, that cold water becomes hot. And that hot water we collect back in our hot liquor tank, and we'll brew with that again the next day. So we're trying to minimize our loss environmentally, so to speak, as we go, because professionally speaking, all those ingredients cost money. So if I can recover some of that water, I can save some money on the next brew, things like that. If I can improve my efficiency, I can save amount of money per pound in terms of grain or hops, things like that. Then after you leave the heat exchanger, you need to aerate your wort so that your wort has oxygen. The first 24 to 48 hours of the yeast life cycle is to consume that oxygen and actually make more of itself. It's called budding. So once they consume that oxygen, they will stop reproducing themselves and they'll begin to eat the sugar to make alcohol. But the first 48 hours, they're typically trying to eat the oxygen to grow more of themselves. They're essentially amassing an army to help them eat all the sugar in that environment. It's a pretty neat thing that yeast and bacteria do. But that's one of the ways you can either grow more yeast is by adding air, or taking that extra step away, you go straight into the alcohol manufacturing. In the fermenter is where you're adding your yeast. Once your fermentation is done, you can go to what's called a bright tank. That's just a second step to transfer your beer to another vessel to clarify it a little bit more. Get it off the extra yeast, get it off the extra hops that are in the bottom. Different proteins settle out over time. So you want to try and remove those as you go before you bottle. Because if you don't, they end up in the bottom of your bottle. And if you've ever had a bottle of beer with a whole bunch of sludge in the bottom, that could be a combination of yeast, hops, or protein left over from the fermentation process itself. Once you got it in the bright tank, you can go to different things. You can age it in a barrel. You can put it in a keg. You can put it in a can, or you can put it in a bottle. There's lots of different ways you can consume that product. Here's another quick kind of advanced homebrew setup. This guy's got a hot water tank, and he's using gravity. As you see, there's no pumps in this. So the reason why things are so high up is this person's designed their system to use no pumps at all. So they need no electricity to get things to flow from one vessel to the other. In a brew house where everything's flat and on the same plane, you need a lot of pumps and electricity to move those liquids around. So this is just another example of how you can let gravity help you. And there's some traditional breweries in the world that use gravity still, where you'll pipe all your water to the top and all your grain to the top. And then once you mash in, you just open a valve, it'll flow to the vessel underneath it and the floor underneath it, and so on and so forth, eventually get into the basement where you'll store your beer. That's a very traditional take. And the reason you store it in the basement is because of temperature fluctuations historically. So there's lots of different ways to kind of skin this cat, so to speak. Here's the kind of the same plane type brewery. You can see this thing right here in the middle. This is a pump that allows him to pump things to different directions. Maybe there's a water kettle right here in the middle, and then you've got your mash over here and your boil kettle over here on your right. So there's lots of different ways to set up your stuff. Let's get back to the quick little process here. When you're doing extract brewing, a lot of extracts have a pretty basic color to them. So say you want to take a yellow extract and make it darker. So you can do what's called a specialty steep, where you buy some chocolate wheat or some roasted barley from the homebrew store. You get them to mill it for you, put it in a tea sack, and just steep that in grain or in a hot water bath for about 30 minutes. And that'll change the color and flavor of that water. Then from there, you can start adding your extract to that. And all of a sudden you have a darker or more nuanced color in your beer based on what you're looking for. After you boil it, you're going to chill it. And like we said earlier, the hot temperatures, a lot of yeast can denature and die. So you want to make sure it's cool enough, typically below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Some yeast strains, like I said, go a little warmer than that, but typically no yeast that you want to drink from will survive 120 degrees. So anything beyond that, you're getting a lot of weird flavors, things that aren't enjoyable. Anything under that is kind of the normal range of operations for yeast. Over here on the right, we're going to ferment and check our gravities. Like I said, your starting gravity or your original gravity is called your OG, and that's how much sugar you start with. And then when you notice that the fermentation is slowing down, you start recording your gravity readings. And when you see a stable gravity, as in like you spend 5 days at the same gravity reading, that's a signal to you that your yeast is done consuming sugar. So therefore, you can consider that style of beer finished. You can cold crash it, which basically means making it cold. The colder that solution is, the more everything heavy wants to fall to the bottom. Cold temperatures assist yeast in flocculation, all that kind of stuff. So after your fermentation is done, you want to cool that down so you can remove the solids. And then from there, that's when you start doing your bottling or your kegging, things like that. Since we're talking about bottling, we'll kind of do this. When we homebrew a bottle or bottle some homebrew, sorry, we typically do that as the beverage is called still or flat. It means it's not carbonated. So you don't need counter pressure to fill this bottle. But in order to get that bottle carbonated under pressure you need to add a little bit of sugar and a little bit of yeast. And how much sugar you add determines how much carbonation you will have in that container in a few weeks. There are different ways to fill in a counter pressure method. So professionally, when you're bottling carbonated beer, there's all sorts of counter pressure devices that will allow you to fill a bottle that's already carbonated and keep that carbonation. But the easiest way to do it at home is to bottle a flat or still beverage and add priming sugar to it. And remember earlier, I talked to you about the fermentation vessel itself having a little bubbler at the top or a way for that gas to escape, so it doesn't over pressurize that bucket. When you are trying to carbonate a beverage, you actually put yeast and sugar in that solution and cap it. So what happens now is that yeast will consume whatever sugar's left and give off some CO2. And since you're able to trap it, all that CO2 goes to the headspace of the bottle. And then you have different gas laws that are actually applicable here, where that gas, if enough is generated in the headspace, that gas will itself go back down into the liquid and naturally carbonate your beverage. That's called bottle conditioning. Professional brewers don't do that a lot because it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for those bottles to appropriately eat that sugar and carbonate your beer. So if you are wanting to do it faster than that, you'll have to have some type of way to carbonate your beverage first, like in a stainless steel keg or something like that. And then you need a counter pressure device to fill that. And I think I might have a picture of it somewhere. We may have already looked at it real quick. So this picture here with the four head filler here, if you look closely, there's actually little plungers at the top of each filler tube. And what that does is it seals off the top of the device or the bottle itself, allowing some gas to come out of it, but keep certain pressure on top while you're filling the liquid. And that doesn't allow the carbonation to escape. But then like the last straw device here, it's not a counter pressure filler. So the beverage has to be still in order for that to work properly. If you don't have the right counter pressure and you're filling a carbonated beverage, essentially you will have just nothing but gushing foam and you won't have the liquid you want in the bottle. So there's a lot of different nuances going into packaging itself too. And real quick, I'm going to exit out of this. In this document here, there are some different links here. So make sure you visit these different links. Your local homebrew store has kits made for all this stuff. If you can't make it out and just want to order something, Northern Brewer and More Beer are really good websites to buy things in a not cheap way, but they're already kind of lumped together for you. So it takes a lot of the work out of trying to figure out what equipment you might need. If you've already got a pot and you only need the basics, they've got everything. If you don't have a good pot to cook it in or a bucket to ferment in, they've got literally everything you need. There's even a new model out there in the world where certain breweries are signing on to homebrewing business websites, and they're saying, these are the ingredients of my beer. If you pay me a small licensing fee, I will allow you to sell a homebrew version of this recipe. So for instance, like, let's see, New Belgium's a pretty big brewery, or Sierra Nevada's a pretty big, well-known brewery. They might license their name, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, to a kit. And so if you like that beer, you can search for kits made by already existing breweries and already existing brands. And so you can essentially try and clone that beer and make it yourself at home. So it's a wild world out there. You can ferment a lot of things to make a lot of stuff. You can get really into it, or you can kind of dabble in it. That's one of the cool things about homebrewing right now. But if you follow any of these links or Google homebrewing kits, there is so much stuff out there for you to try. I don't homebrew very much anymore because I do it for a living. It's the last thing I want to do on the weekend. I want to kind of enjoy my family and hang out in the garden or just kind of work on my house. But, before I was a professional brewer, I was brewing every weekend at home, just really thirsty for knowledge, trying to figure out how to do this stuff. You can take it as far as you want to. Where I'm teaching this from right now is the Brewing and Distilling Center. It's a place where we literally teach professionals how to become a professional in the brewing world. When you graduate from the courses that we teach here, you have the knowledge to go to work at any brewery. When I started my career as a brewer, I didn't know anything at all. I just had no idea. I just knew I liked beer. I enjoyed drinking it, but how do you make it? There was no school for me to go to when I first started. So I started by going to a homebrew store in Atlanta and just talking to the owner. And I'm like, hey, this is kind of what I'm into. And they would help me out. So people that own homebrew stores, if you like that interaction, I highly encourage you to go to them and just kind of say, hey, I'm really getting into this. I don't know where to start, or this is the level I'm at already. Do you have anything more for me? Do you have some other special ingredients you could order for me to try? There's different flavors, there's different fruits, spices, there's all sorts of things you can include in your beer to make a different product than you did before. So if that's something you're really into, experimental cooking, homebrewing is an endless supply of stuff to kind of get into a little bit. And then real quickly, I'll end this with just a quick little 6-minute video. And if we run out of time, we can stop this whenever we need to.
Welcome to the world of beer brewing. In this demonstration, we'll go over the entire process of brewing beer at home, from grain to glass. When it's time for your brew day, make sure you have all the equipment and ingredients you need before you get started. If you have a starter kit, refer to the included equipment list. Brew day is ready to begin. The first step is to collect water and fill your kettle with 6 gallons of clean, good-tasting water. Next, pour the steeping grains from your recipe into a mesh bag. Tie it closed and place it in the water. Then tie it to the handle of the kettle. Turn your stove to high to steep your grains for 30 minutes.
So these grains he's using there are just adding color. They're not adding any sugar.
During this time, use your thermometer to monitor the temperature of the water as it heats. If the water reaches 170 degrees in under 30 minutes, turn off the heat and allow the grains to finish steeping off heat. Once done, remove the mesh bag. You can let the absorbed liquid drain out, but don't squeeze the bag. Continue heating the water until it reaches a boil. Once the water boils, turn off the heat and add the malt extract included with your recipe. Add it slowly, taking care to stir enough to dissolve it completely. Once all the extract is dissolved, turn the heat back on and bring the liquid to a boil once again. Once a rolling boil is reached, be careful not to let the liquid boil over. Adjust the heat to maintain a gentle rolling boil and start your hop timer. Most beer recipes call for a 1-hour boil, starting at the end of the hot break, and the hops that give your beer its bitterness are added at the beginning of this 60-minute period. Add these hops to a bag, put them in the liquid, and tie them to the kettle. At this point, you should have some downtime while the liquid is boiling and before the next kettle addition. This is a great opportunity to make sanitizer to sanitize the remaining equipment, which can be done all in one bucket. Add some sanitizer to your fermenter filled with water and give it a good shake to make sure it's fully sanitized. Next, set up your wort chiller, then place it in your kettle with 20 minutes remaining in the boil.
So
be sure to connect the chiller's hose to your water source and direct the open end somewhere safe, like a sink.
Cool his wort down.
Add more hops throughout the boil period according to your recipe. If your recipe calls for any clarifiers like whirlflock, they should be added with 5 minutes remaining in the boil. Your recipe may have other ingredients that it calls for adding late in the boil or at the end, called flame out additions. Make these additions as instructed. Once you reach the end of your boil, turn off the heat and begin cooling your wort. Cover the kettle and slowly turn on the water until you reach a slow but steady stream coming out of the chiller. Run the chiller until the wort reaches a safe temperature for your yeast. Then, begin transferring your wort to your sanitized fermenter. Install the vinyl tubing from your kit to the spigot on the kettle and direct the open end into your fermenter. Transfer a small amount of the wort to your hydrometer jar to measure the sugars. Gently drop the hydrometer into the jar. Let it come to a rest, then note the specific gravity on the recipe sheet or in your beer log. Next, use sanitized scissors to cut open the yeast packet. Then open the fermenter and pour the yeast into the wort. Oxygen is essential for yeast growth and reproduction, so make sure to aerate the wort by giving the fermenter a good shake before you leave it to ferment. Fermentation is the process by which the yeast consume the sugars present in the wort and convert them to alcohol and carbon dioxide. Place the fermenter somewhere out of direct light and with as steady as possible of a temperature, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit for fermentation. You should see the first signs of fermentation within a day or 2, or 3. It varies because yeast is a living organism. You'll see bubbles form on the surface of the wort, activity in the airlock, and eventually thick foam called krausen will form before it falls back into the beer. About 7 to 10 days after the point of high krausen, your beer will be done fermenting. You're ready to bottle when there's been no activity in the airlock for about 3 days. Once you've got fermented beer, it's time to bottle and carbonate it. Carbonation is provided by adding a small amount of fresh sugar into the bottle and then sealing it. Boil the included sugar in 2 cups of water until dissolved and set aside. Next, move the fermenter to the edge of a counter or table so you can fill the bottle via siphon. Make some sanitizer and sanitize the remaining bottling equipment, including the tubing and bottle filler. Sanitize your bottles by submerging them for 2 minutes and then letting them drain. A bottle rack or bottle tree is very helpful, but any foam remaining in the bottles is absolutely fine. Don't fear the foam is what they always say. Transfer your beer from your fermenter into a separate bucket placed below it. Connect the tubing and open the spigot. Add the priming sugar solution to the bucket so that it is evenly distributed to the wort. Once the bottling bucket is filled, it's helpful to move it onto a counter. Install the bottle filler's open end directly onto the spigot of the bottling bucket.
So this is a really simple bottling
Fill the
wand right
hydrometer
here.
jar first, which you can set aside until you are done bottling. Then, sanitize your bottle caps in a small bowl and keep them handy. Next, it's time to begin filling. Fill the bottle all the way to the top and then lower it away from the filler, leaving about 1 inch of headspace in the bottle. To cap the bottles, press down firmly on the capper's handles to crimp the cap onto the bottle. You should leave a round dimple in the top of the bottle cap if you've sealed the bottle firmly enough. Use your hydrometer to measure the specific gravity of the finished beer. You can approximate the beer's alcohol content pretty closely using these measurements. Once the bottles are filled, they are set aside for 2 weeks to allow natural carbonation to occur. This additional time in the bottle is also important for full maturation of the beer's flavors and aroma. At the end of your 2-week wait, move a couple of bottles into the fridge overnight, crack open your homebrew, and enjoy. You've just made beer.
All right. So that's it for that. And that's just to kind of go over quickly all the things we talked about in a small little thing so you can actually visually see these since I didn't show you these in person, just to give you an idea of what it actually takes to brew that, boil that, cool that, and then bottle that. And I'm all wrapped up on my end. Does anybody have any questions so far? Or where do I look to see those questions? Let's see.
We had just 2 in the chat from me
Okay.
and Shelly. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can unmute. Feel free to unmute and ask.
Here we go.
And these may have been answered since we've asked
Okay.
them, but Shelly says, what are your thoughts on beer brewing starter kits? Are those good for people looking to experiment?
Yes, I think that's a great place to start for people who are really unsure about what to do. You don't, before you go buy a whole bunch of really cool equipment and spend a whole lot of money, a starter kit usually has everything you need to get started to see if you actually like the process. It's fun, but there is work involved. So it's not as fun as like, making painting, which is a little less physically intensive. There's a lot that goes into brewing. So I suggest starting with the starter kit before you go buy a whole bunch of other stuff, because you may find you buy all that stuff and you go, I really am not into this. I can't believe I just spent $900 on all this stuff. Those kits can get you started in like $20 to $30 range using your own equipment. Like maybe you already have a big soup pot at home, or maybe you've already got a bucket at home, things like that. You can get started without really buying too much. So I think those are really helpful for people getting started.
Awesome.
Let's see. So the next one you said, let's see. Temperature fluctuations can create off flavors. Is it safe to do this inside your home rather than leaving it outside? I think it's much more important to have this in your home than outside of your home. Creatures, insects, bugs, they all want that sugar. So the more you can isolate what you've made from the outside world, the more likely you are to have a drinkable beer at the end. If you've got it outside, if there's a small leak in the bucket or the lid's not sealed all the way, or maybe ferments so heavily that foam comes out the top of the bucket in the little vent, ants and insects will automatically be drawn to that. So it's better to do this in a home environment or somewhere inside a shelter. Maybe it's a garage, something like that. That way it's away from natural critters, because you're making sugar and there's lots of things that want to eat sugar in this world. So I would say making it outside is okay, like the boiling part, the backyard patio brew setup is okay. But once you're introducing yeast and cooling it off, you may want to bring it inside to help with temperature fluctuations and infection. Are there any more questions, or is that it? I can talk about beer all day. That is not hard for me. So you just let me know. And my email's on the PowerPoint too. So I'm happy to, part of my job is to educate within Yeehaw and here at the BDC. So I love talking to people about beer. I love educating people on what I do. I feel like the more people understand what we as brewers do, the more fun they'll have in our tap room and the more interested they are in trying different flavors. What you might have 24 different beers on draft. What's to get people interested in coming back? That conversation, that using that local barley or that local hop or locally harvested yeast or local honey, for example, or local lavender. The more you include varying things or local ingredients, the more context you have for making very different beers and having those people come back to you. As a brewer, it's a hard lesson to learn. I can make the best beer in the world. It could literally be the best, but if no one comes to buy it, it doesn't matter if it's the best. And I can make the absolute crappiest beer in the world. If people are buying it hand over fist, then that's a success. And that's not necessarily ethically where I want to take my beer, but it's just a hard lesson to learn that as a brewer, you can be so technical, so perfect, but if you don't have that story or that relationship with the customer, you aren't going to sell that. And that's ultimately what you need to do in a professional world. And that's one of the reasons why I like homebrewing so much, is you can kind of do some more experimental stuff with your friends and just kind of note the things. You're not really worried about selling it. You're just kind of worried about the experience of trying something new. My wife likes to bake at home. She loves making sourdough, so she'll keep her own starter, and she's getting to experimenting with different types of salts or different types of minerals to the water. So you can take it as little or as much as you want with home brewing. And that's one of the coolest things about it to me.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. We've had
You're very
just a
welcome.
great time with you today, and you've taught us so much. I have done a little bit of a home starter kit. I got my husband one year for some type of gift, and of course it sat there for a while, and I said, well, I'm making us some beer.
So you
And
did
it
it?
was-
That's awesome.
It was easy to do. You just follow the directions. And so it's really interesting. I would not want to spend all the money and do it all the time, I don't think, because it is pretty involved, but
Right.
you really know what you're talking about. And this has been so enjoyable to just learn from you. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of University of Tennessee Extension. Thank you for being our partner and our
Thank
speaker
you.
today. And just to let everybody know that's still on, everybody that signed up for these sessions will receive a recap newsletter with all those links that Chris provided us, also with his contact information. So if you want to contact him directly, that would be great. And then just also the recording of today's session, if you want to share it with anybody. So thank you everyone so much for participating, and we will see you soon.
All right. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Have a good day.